Hey everyone, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to part 11 of my Logic Pro 10 201 course. This will be the second video where I do a bunch of arrangement building. In particular, I'm going to be working with the verses of the song. So ignore my markers up here. They don't make sense right now. I got to go back and fix those. But what I've done with the first verse is this.
Can't you see it? Can you feel it? Can you hear it call your name? It's a broken world alone. We got kids with no shelter, lies from our leaders, pain from the sky to the sea. Death with no freedom, hearts with no heroes. Baby, it's just you and me.
So the transition here doesn't make much sense right now, but we'll come back and fix that in a later video. And then the second verse is sort of like a harder version of that. And you can see I've broken up the arrangement a little bit. That's why I said ignore the markers, because the markers do not match what's going on down here right now. And then I actually ended up replacing the intro with the beat from the second verse. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this sort of instrumental intro, put some sort of like a softer build into this, and then that'll take us to the first verse, which is like a softer version of that hard beat. So in this video, I'm not going to work in reverse like I did in the previous video. I'm actually going to try to do as much of this live as I can. And I'll try to do this as quickly as I can and explain everything that I've done. Crazy enough, that whole verse section started as a variation on the chords in the first verse, and then I created the hard beat out of that, and then essentially just did some fancy copying and pasting. So what I ended up doing with the chord progression that was originally in the verse, which is just a very simple progression like this, was I took it and I fleshed it out with some additional notes. So you can see that the underlying chord is basically the same. I just have this sort of little high motif going on in the top. So let's pick an instrument for that. I don't like the synth layer for this, so I actually pulled this out of the synth layer track and put it on its own track. So for this, I'm going to add alchemy here. And alchemy, as you probably already know, is an incredibly versatile instrument. And I'm trying to go for that like retro synth wave sound. So I'm going to search up 80s, see what we can find from the 80s. 80s digital piano. Let's try that. And then I'll click on the Advanced tab because I'm going to go through and change some of the synth parameters for this. So let me just put this in a loop and let's give this a listen.
Can't you see it? Can you feel it?
So I want to put a bit of a stuttering effect on this, like a 16th note stutter. So one of the really cool things about Alchemy is you can click on any of the knobs and they'll turn blue like this, and it'll show all of the modulation parameters for that knob. So a stutter effect's pretty simple. Just grab your master volume here, create a new modulation target here, and I'm going to use a sequencer for this. So remember, going back to the ES2, you just pretty much had like LFOs and envelopes, or ADSRs. Well, there's LFOs and AHDSRs, which are envelopes, but there's another type of envelope. There's an MSEG envelope, there's a sequencer, there's an envelope follower. So there's all these different modulation tools in Alchemy. We're gonna use the sequencer, and let's give this a listen as is. Doesn't seem to be doing anything, and that's because we haven't pulled up the modulation depth here. This is kind of like that little green slider in the ES2. So I'll pull this all the way up. If you wanted to change the speed, you could change the rate right here. Maybe I wanted 1/8 notes instead of 16ths. I do want 16ths, so I'll put it back on 16ths. So that's all I'm going to do with Alchemy for the moment. Let's add some other effects to this. First, I'm going to add an EQ because it's kind of bright for my taste. I just kind of want to scoop out quite a bit of the high end and the lows. I just want to bandpass filter it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the overdrive plugin. And what this is going to do is give me some grit and drive. So a nice bright overdrive. And with this, typically when you increase the drive, you want to compensate by lowering the output volume, because as you add drive, the overall volume is going to get louder. Now you can see that I've already copied and pasted the kick drum side chain up here above it because we are going to use it. So after the overdrive, I'm going to go ahead and add the compressor and select that tight kick as the side chain source. And let's pull down the threshold, pull up the ratio, and dial this in. And let's add some reverb, some more reverb to it. I know Alchemy has a bit of reverb in it, but let's add chroma verb. And I'm going to use the Synth Hall preset. All right, next up, I've got a piano that I added here, and the same thing I did with the original chord progression, I just took that chord progression and elaborated on it. So this piano sounds like this. It's just a EXS-24 instrument with the Steinway Grand 2 selected, and then I've got Space Designer on here using the Fine Hall preset under the large halls. So it's kind of handling the mid-range of the chords. So I'm going to do a cool little trick that I like to do with piano. I'm going to drag over both of these. I'm going to hit Control-B. This is going to bring up the bounce in place region. And I'm going to call this reverse piano because we're going to create a reverse piano effect. Now this already has reverb on it, so I want to make sure that the audio tail is included in the file and in the region. So what this will do is it'll bounce the region past the length of the region to include the reverb, which we absolutely want. I don't want to bypass plugins. I don't want to include volume or pan automation. I don't want to normalize. And the source, I'm just going to leave it because we're actually going to use both of them. So I'll hit OK. And then this will bounce that region as an audio file. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to cut this thing up into little segments. So I'm going to use my scissors tool and cut this up into some small little segments, just like so. And I'll just repeat this whole section because it's the same thing. Then I'll drag over all these clips, go over to your region inspector, and select the reverse button here. And it reverses all of those clips. So now I have a reverse chord on top of a regular chord. So I don't think we need these two, so I'll get rid of those on both of those. Let's see what that sounds like. So this part I definitely want to use in my second chorus. You know what, while I'm at it, let me go ahead and remove my current markers because these are going to be changed in the future. So I'll remove those. And I'll put my snap mode on bar. And what I'm going to do is copy, so Option, click and drag, and duplicate. So I'll unmute the hard beat over in the second verse, and let's give this a listen. So the synth is like really blaring loud because of the lack of the sidechain compression. So I'm just gonna duplicate these over here, and it should duck that down a bit.
It's just a tragedy. You got it all, but you can't break free. You're losing time when you're wasting lives. Your karma's on the line. We got kids with no future.
Let's elaborate on this little high, motif here. So I'm gonna create another software instrument. I'll put it right here below the verse synth. I'll just call this verse lead. And I'll copy this down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of simplify this a bit because I'm going to essentially create a monophonic lead. So for these bottom notes, I'm going to get rid of all of them. And I'm going to make sure that there's only one note in the bass, essentially. So like here, there's two. So I'm going to get rid of that one. Here, there's two. So I'm going to get rid of that one. And that should do it. And actually, the patch I'm going to use is really simple. It's actually the ES2, and it's just the stock patch. And it sounds like this. But I'm going to make this a bit more complex and detune it a bit by turning on unison, pulling up the voice count to like 8, putting this on legato, and then pulling up the analog knob. Let's see what it sounds like now. There we go. So I pulled up the drive a bit, pulled down the master volume just so it wasn't so blaringly loud. I also don't want it so bright, so I'm going to go ahead and add an EQ as well, just to soften the top end a bit. So let's see what both of these sound like together now.
It's just a tragedy. You got it all.
So I feel like the piano just gets in the way now. So I'm going to press Control-M to mute those. I'm not going to delete them. I may want to bring them back in later for a couple little things. But really what I'm missing now is a bass. I need to create a bass line. So I'll create a new software instrument track. I'll pull this up here. I'll just call this verse bass. And I'm going to use retro synth for this. And I'm going to load a preset under synth bass called Biting FM. And this is really where the sort of synthwave retro 80s sound is going to come from. But first, I need to actually create a bass line. So I'm going to copy one of these down here, and I'm going to use the root note of each chord to more or less build out the bass line. So it starts on B, and all this can kind of just go away. The next chord is B, D, G, and that's because the chord is a G major chord, but it's in an inversion. So I'm going to pull this down an octave. That is a E, so I'm going to Shift Option, pull that down. And that's just going to be a half note. So I can just delete this, delete these two. So let's see, this chord is B, E, G. So I believe the root note here is going to be E. I'm going to pull that down an octave. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take this out. I'm going to make this 2 bars long. And then this will be E. This is going to go back to B, so we don't need those. So we got to choose between C sharp, A, or C sharp, E, or G. I'm going to go with G. You know what? I take it back. There was another note here on A, that's actually the note, because the chord is actually A, C sharp, E. It's an A major chord. It's just in an inversion. So I'm gonna pull the A down. And that should work. Cool. So by itself, it's pretty boring. Let me just play it with the beat here. So let's transform this and give it some motion. The first thing I'm gonna do is add an arpeggiator. And with the arpeggiator, I'm just gonna use the up motion, 16th notes. But I'm gonna use a 2-octave range. So you're gonna hear that bottom note jump around. So that's a little obnoxious. So let's put this on variation 3. And in addition to that, I'm going to add the compressor and use the kick drum up here as a sidechain source again. And let's see what that does. Now I feel like I want it to have a lot more grit and bass than that. So I'm gonna add some distortion to it. I'm going to distortion. There's a bunch of different types of distortion. I'm gonna go with the phase distortion. And let's see if we can play around with one of these settings. And I wonder if I can pull this down one more octave. So probably these two notes are gonna have to go up an octave. They're just too low. I also find going back into retro synth and playing around with its low pass filter here to be helpful to sculpt the tone, and you can play around with the filter FM knob as well. I'm going to do that just to get a more precise plucky tone, but I still want it to have like a lot of dirt and distortion to it. Cool. So let's play that with everything in, except for the vocals, of course. You know what? I want the verse lead to also have sidechain compression on it too. So let's add that in. I know I don't want this same bass for the first verse. It's going to be too aggressive. Let's see what that sounds like. Yeah, it works fine over here. But over here, it's just too much. So let me go ahead and duplicate this bass track here. And I'll pull it down. And on this track, let me add a channel EQ and just scoop out some of the high end. Cool. And I'm adding EQs to a lot of these and scooping out certain frequencies. And this is going to be helpful later too, because we can go back in and we can automate some of these plugins to maybe open up the bass slowly over time instead of keeping it static. But that's something I'll handle later in mixing. I feel like the bass still needs to be a bit more punchy. I wonder if I added the tremolo plugin to it just to give it a little bit more punch, because what happens is that phase distortion kind of softens the attack, and I want to harden that attack again. So let's set this to a 16th note. Let's make sure that these are in phase. So double click and type in 0, and then we can adjust the symmetry here. There we go. Pull down the smoothing, just like so. And I don't really need, this doesn't have to be all the way up. It's going to be too jagged sounding, but I'll blend it in. Cool, so I've got my basic sort of hard-hitting, synthwave sound here in the second verse and a more subdued version of it in the first verse. Like I said, I am not a big fan of using this as an intro, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy this whole section over here. There we go. And I'm going to kick in the vocals here. Actually, if you watched the sort of bonus video I released on Christmas, I tuned up my vocals with Melodyne because I couldn't take it anymore. So I'm going to press Control B on these and bounce them in place as well. So I'll just say scratch vocals. And the reason why I'm doing this is because it's not easy with Melodyne to copy and paste things that have been tuned. I know with the new ARA features you can, but I don't think I'm using ARA for this track. So I think I'm just going to do that. So now I can just copy and paste out my chorus wherever I see fit. Now, one thing I'm going to change pretty big time is the end of the chorus here. It ends like this.
Tell me how, when all the world is lost, we're losing ground.
Right there, where I say ground, that's where the new second verse is going to start. And it's not going to be like a regular 2-section verse. It's actually going to be a 3-section verse. So I'm going to pull this back and then duplicate this first section one time. Actually, you know what? Let's duplicate the back end of it, because the back end's got a kind of a cool drum fill. And I'll pull that back. So this is just going to end on losing ground, the word ground. And I'm going to have to play around with where these go. And this leaves some room for me to add some sort of like vocal echoes or whatever in here. But it also just gives me some space between the chorus and the next verse.
Losing ground.
And then the second verse would start there. The lyrics, at least, would.
It's just a tragedy. You got it all, but you can't break free. You're losing time when you're wasting lives. The colors on the line.
Make sure I copy and paste over those sidechain kicks, otherwise the compressor is going to go crazy. And I'll go ahead and copy and paste the chorus over as well. I'll just select all of that. And I like to just use bar snap to move things like this, because when you're really zoomed out, it's hard to see what increment you're moving by. I realize I'm missing a couple kicks in here. It's no big deal. Just hit Command R a few times to paste them back in. Let's see what that sounds like.
Kids with no future, lies from our leaders, paint from the sky to the sea. A world torn asunder, hate for our brothers,
Cool. So really the only other thing I've done is just gone through and sort of played around with levels and made minor adjustments. And those minor adjustments got me to here where I'm at now. The only other thing I did was I repeated the same phrasing at the end of the chorus, the second chorus over here, going into another verse idea. Although it's not going to be another verse idea, it's going to be a just more or less like an outro. So let me go ahead and in this session, let me just rename these sections here. So you can create a marker, double click, give it a name, set your playhead where you want the next section to be, and rinse and repeat. One thing I want you to be aware of is there's a pretty big difference between arrangement markers and markers. If you want to learn how to work with arrangement markers, I have a video on that somewhere on YouTube. It's pretty recent too. Just search up Logic Pro 10 arrangement markers, you'll find it. Those let you kind of move sections around, but when you're sort of working left to right like I am, it's not always the most useful way to build arrangements, but it is a pretty cool tool. I'll just call this outro. And one last thing I did is I copied and pasted a couple words from the last phrase on the outro here. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to end it, whether I'm going to fade out or just sort of cut on like a big note or something like that. I'm not really sure yet. So that's pretty much it for this video, guys. In the next video, I'm going to focus on the transitions between the different sections, because although the musical ideas I think I have within each section are pretty good, the transitions between them don't sound so hot. And that's what I'm going to do in the next video, is focus on the transitions. So I'm going to leave you with a playthrough of what I have so far. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to see more content like this. As always, thanks for the support, and thanks for watching. It's a broken world alone. We got kids with no shelter, lies from our leaders, pain from the sky to the sea. Death with no freedom, hearts with no heroes. Baby, it's just you and me.